In this video, I will show you the 5 most important endgame principles. Make sure to stick until the very end for the most important one. And without wasting any more time, let's begin with the first endgame principle. So, the first principle is to activate your king. And this right here is the most primitive and beautiful example of this. It's white to move in this position. This game is played between Nigel Short and Jan Timman. And if we just look at the position, white is completely and utterly dominating. White has the only open file, which is always good. White's queen is phenomenally placed. The only saving grace in black's position is this battery right here. Right? Ideally, white would play the move knight g5 to put even more pressure on the f7 pawn. However, because of this battery, queen takes g2 is a threat. So, what does Nigel Short play in this position? He starts off with the move king to h2. There is actually a very, very sneaky idea. Now, something I would like to mention. If black greedily takes the pawn on a4, the problem is you are no longer having a battery, and this allows white to play the move knight g5 without this checkmate threat. If black goes back, then white won't repeat moves. White will play the move pawn to f3, and now the f7 pawn will be lost. Rook f4 is also a threat. This is completely winning. So, all of black's pieces are completely paralyzed. So what did black play here? Rook to c8. Black doesn't really have anything better. King to g3. And slowly we see that idea. Because black has no moves, black is in Zugzwang, white is looking to activate the king and bring it to a very specific square. Rook ce8, king to f4, bishop c8, king to g5, sacrificing the rook. And hopefully you guys can see the point. If we get bishop takes d7, king to h6 is an unstoppable checkmate. Right, this checkmate pattern is very common with a pawn. Usually you have a pawn on one of these two squares and the queen kind of swoops in. This is called a lobster pincer mate. But because there is no pawn, Short had to adapt and instead brought the king. So bishop takes d7 does not work. King h7 is virtually forced because otherwise white will play king to h6. And what did I mention? What was the king doing on g8? It was defending or protecting the f7 pawn. Now, there's only one protector, so white can crash through with the move rook takes f7. Even better, though, is to play queen takes g6 check. You can't take back because of the pin. And after king to h8, queen h6, king g8, the nail in the coffin, king to f6. White brought the king from g1 all the way to f6. And this shows the power. This is the heart and soul of activating your king. In a position where your opponent is in Zugzwang, has no useful moves, in a position where it's very closed, you can buy yourself time. You are allowed to do stuff like this, putting your pieces on the most active squares. Right? It's all about understanding what you want to achieve in the position. Like I mentioned, if we go all the way back here, the only thing black had here is this battery. We wanted to play the move knight g5 and put more pressure on f7, but we couldn't. Right? If we play rook to f4, trying to put more pressure on the f7 pawn, well then our rook on d7 hangs. Right, so where all of these pieces here are placed on the best squares. So it's just about kind of connecting the dots and seeing what can we actually do. Is there a way to improve our position? And yeah, Short just came up with this beautiful idea of activating the king. Let's now move on to the second example of activating your king. This is the second example I have for you guys, and it's black to move. So, the first thing you have to think about whenever you're in an endgame, can you liquidate it into an easier endgame? Meaning, if there are queens on the board, can you trade queens and enter a favorable endgame? In this position right here, the question you have to be asking yourself is, can you trade rooks? Does this lead to an advantageous endgame? Well, if we kind of reverse engineer the question, what happens if we do not trade rooks? Well, let's just say we play a move like rook to h4, looking to kind of attack the h2 pawn. The problem is, this runs right into rook c7 check. All of our queenside pawns will be lost, and then white will just start pushing these queenside pawns. So we've actually concluded something very important here. Our rook cannot get off of the c file. If we move our rook, then rook c7 check is a huge threat. So what does that mean for us? Either we trade the rooks, or we play the move pawn to b5. These are the only two options we have. If we play the move pawn to b5, the problem is white will just take, and after king to c3, this pawn is lost, and white has the 2-on-1. This is a winning endgame. So by kind of reverse engineering the question, we have to trade rooks. So Rubinstein, of course, traded rooks, and this right here is the key position. The majority of people, when they hear the term king activation, they automatically bring their king into the center of the board. And while this is an okay rule of thumb, right, in general, pieces in the center are more active, you have to actually look at the specific position at hand. Is your king really doing all that much in the center? Let's take a look. King d6, king d2, king d5, king d3. Have we actually achieved something as black? The answer is no, right? We are the ones in opposition. This is something I will mention later. And we just don't really have anything special here. So let's go all the way back to this position right here. Where do we actually want our king? Is there a weakness in white's pawn structure? If the answer is yes, ideally, we want our king right up in the action, pressing against that weakness. The queenside pawn structure is phenomenal, right? This is a normal 2-on-2. Here we have doubled pawns, and most importantly, we have an isolated pawn. What does this mean for us? Rubinstein played king f6, king g5, king h4, and king to h3. This right here is the correct king activation, right? You have to look at it specifically at the position and see where can your king maximize its value. And even though after king to g1, white's king is just in time, just the disparity, right? The difference between the king activation is huge, and this will decide the game. So how does Rubinstein continue? Pawn to e5, binding the f3 pawn. Right now, f4 becomes virtually impossible. A very nice move here, pawn to b5, also kind of binding the a4 square and preventing this pawn from pushing. And now it's just about finding a way through, right? The best thing that black can do here is just launch these pawns forward and try to kind of open this up, right? Find like a crack in the position, because this would allow the king to kind of infiltrate. So let's see how Rubinstein continues here. Pawn to f5, pawn to g5, pawn to h5. All four pawns are down the board. And pawn to g4, the first break has occurred. Pawn to e4 from the white side. Very important, do not take on f3, right? The pawn will now become a queen, so always be careful. It's never too late to blunder. F takes e4 was the move played. And after f takes e4, pawn to h4, pawn to g3, and finally we have shattered white's pawn structure. All the pawns will be traded off, and this is a winning king and pawn endgame. The easiest way to win this is to just bring your king and win this pawn. Once that pawn is won, you can just bring your king over to the queen side, and the white king is bound to the outside passed pawn, right? If the white king would go too far, this pawn would become a queen. This is the power of having an outside passed pawn. The second endgame principle is known as the Tarrasch rule. And the Tarrasch rule basically says that rooks belong behind passed pawns. Here we have a passed pawn, here we have a rook. The move which white should play here is rook to a1. So important. A move like rook to b5 is still okay, right? You still have a passed pawn. However, this now allows black to put the rook behind the pawn, right? So now black is the one utilizing the Tarrasch rule, and our rook is just very awkward on b5, right? We can't really ever push our passed pawn because then the rook would simply take, and it's just kind of difficult to make progress. We would kind of have to bring our king, and this is just very annoying. Much easier is to simply play rook to a1, and now we are the ones who can just push the pawn down the board. Rook to e7, a6, rook to a7, and now the black rook is completely tied down to the a6 pawn. This is perfect, right? Our rook has so much space here, while black's rook is completely tied down. We can always play the move rook to a5, and then our rook is doing two things at once, while black's rook is only doing one thing. That's something to kind of keep in mind. And now, once black's rook is tied down, what do we do now? We activate our king. Remember, principle number one. king to f3, king to f6, king e4, king e6, king d4, king d6. And now our position is so good, right? Black is virtually in Zugzwang. Black can't really make an improving move. Rook to a2 is more than good enough. If the king goes to c6, we can enter this way. And if the king goes to e6, we can enter this way. If the rook ever moves, we push the pawn. And if the rook goes to a8, well, then we push the pawn again. Right, so these kind of waiting moves, these come from a superior position. Right, so many different elements come into play here, right? You have the opposition, you have the active rook, right? Because your rook is behind here, you have kind of this leeway to make these kind of like small moves. Black doesn't have this luxury. If the rook ever moves, the pawn keeps going down the board. In this position right here, Black played king to c6, and after king to e5, the position is completely won. King b6, king f6, there's no need to analyze any further. If the rook ever takes the pawn, this is a completely winning king and pawn endgame. The third endgame principle is what I like to refer to as a pawn barrier. And this is very typical in a closed position. Now, right here is the most primitive form of a pawn barrier. It's white to move, and there is only one move which saves the game. Now, if we remember principle number 1, king activation, Black's king is much more active than our king. Our king is in no man's land on h1. If it were Black to move in this position, what move do you think Black would play? Well, if we remember king activation, it would probably be to go king to c5, looking at this weakness on b2. What does that mean for us? We can play the move pawn to b4, and now these three pawns have created an impenetrable barrier for the black king to enter. So the third principle, the pawn barrier, kind of counterbalances the first principle of king activation. And the position is simply a draw, right? There is no way for black to enter. Black can't really make any progress with a5. This just kind of gives us a passed pawn. And yeah, we have saved the game with the move pawn to b4. The fourth endgame principle is something known as opposition. Opposition is basically just a fancy term where both kings are opposing each other and the player who has to make the move enters into a disadvantageous position. Now, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I actually created 2 videos about opposition. One about direct opposition and one about indirect opposition. I will make sure to link them in the description below. Now, if we look at the specific position at hand, there is one and only one move which wins the game for white. And that is the move king to h4. Definitely not an easy move to play if you've never heard of opposition. And the whole point is that we are opposing the enemy king, right? They're kind of butting heads now. And after the long sequence, king g6, king g4, king f6, king f4, king e6, king e4, king d6, king d4, king c6, king c4, king b6, king takes b4, king c6, king to c4, we are the ones who still have opposition, and this right here is a winning king and pawn endgame. Just to illustrate why opposition is so unbelievably important, if white goes for the move king to g4, it looks the exact same, right? You're just looking to win the b4 pawn. The problem is black has this incredible resource, pawn to b3. And the whole point is that you have to take, and now black plays king to g6, and it's black who has opposition, right? Our pawn is not far enough down the board, right? Black's king is inside of the square, is what we call this. And if we kind of just bring our kings here, this right here is a drawn king and pawn endgame. You have to know your king and pawn endgames. The fifth endgame principle, which helped me reach 2000 elo, is knowing theoretical endgames. Now, instead of going through all of the different theoretical endgames, I will actually put on the screen all of the endgames you should know depending on your elo. So if I were you, I would pause the video right now and see which endgames you should know. If there are some endgames which you do not know, I would highly recommend to watch YouTube videos about that endgame. Every once in a while, you will reach one of these theoretical endgames, and not knowing how to convert them will simply lose you points, right? You'll be drawing positions you should not be drawing, and you will be losing positions you absolutely should not be losing. And with that, we have reached the end of this video. I would like to thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you guys in the next video.